Good. Okay, then I think we move on to the next speaker. So thank you, Sasha.
Thank you. Bye.
And the next speaker is Stefan Mihalas from the Institute MindScope Program. And the title of his talk is Cortex, a hierarchically organized set of canonical local circuits.
Oh, can you see my screen?
Yes, and we can hear you loud and clear, so that's good.
Today I'm going to talk about a little bit in the introduction for the general principles we use to build cortical models, a little bit about local circuits, and a little bit more about how local circuits are put together. So one of the important elements from my perspective when constructing models of processing in neurons is to take in account not only information about structure and activity, but also information about the computations which are performed by these circuits, because this is in the end what they are designed for. There are generally described two types of models, one which start from structure and try to go towards activity, and some which start from computation and predict activity. Some of the typical examples here being the models which Anton and I, our groups work together on building the data-driven model for the Allen Institute, and the typical model which start from computations are those coming from Jim DiCarlo's lab. But most of the time they don't overlap much. Part of the goal, which would be, is to try to combine these types of models, or at least have models which are going to be able to reach bottom-up models, which reach all the way to the level of computations, and top-down models, which go on to the level, to a somewhat more realistic level of the structure. There is another element which is important to realize when building data-driven models is how incredibly complex this circuit is. So the mammalian brain is probably the most relevant number is going to be at the level of synapses, which are on the order of 10 to the 12 for a mouse, 10 to the 15 for a human. And just as a comparison, this number is dwarfs, if you were to just associate a few bytes for each synapse, this is going to dwarf in terms of information everything, all the information which is present in the Library of Congress. So thinking about how much effort do we need to put in to be able to include all of this data, what I want to say is that we need to be careful that we don't necessarily need to include data. What we want to find out is what are the principles behind the data. And we know that there are principles because the brain is not defined by 10 to the 15 elements which are going to define their connections, but rather it is a process from development from a set of genes which is much, much lower in amount of information, and via learning of systems which are also things which we can understand. So rather than trying to think on to how do we build purely data-driven models, I would like to say that there is an important step which is required between data and the construction of the model, which is going to be the idea of extracting knowledge from all of these elements in terms of structure, activity, and computation. And we need to be a little bit careful that as a theoretical physicist, I've always been, as an ex-theoretical physicist, I've always been told that the models which I'm trying to construct are a little bit too simple. I would still have to say that they are sometimes useful, but it is important to realize that we need to build models of multiple levels of resolution so we don't end up with a spherical model of the brain. For cortex, we are very interested in studying cortex, and cortex is a very interesting structure which is typical for mammalians, but it appeared in mammalian-like reptiles. And one of the interesting things about the cortex is that it varies enormously in size, and even between evolutionarily related organisms, sometimes the cortex can be hugely different. And while the global structure is really complex and we need a lot of information to characterize it, typically the microstructure is somewhat similar, but not identical across areas. This has led to the general principal view that we can view that there are elements which are almost as a translationally invariant or a translationally equivariant type of element as a canonical cortical column. And if we begin to understand, the approach would be to study the structure, activity, and computations in a local circuit, to separate the computations which are happening locally, and then to see how are the local circuits put together to generate activity and computations at a system level. And we are going to take this approach and study these elements one by one, but we need to be careful on what are the principles and how do we put them together. So to start with the models for a local circuit, and this is something which was it has been discussed quite a bit before, so I don't need to present a lot how this was put together. We constructed in parallel biophysical and generalized leak, integrate, and fire model of V1 activity. Was a collaboration between Anton's group and mine, and we this was spearheaded by Yazan Bilech and with primary direction from Anton in terms of being able to incorporate huge amounts of knowledge, I would say, from the field, in which there was a lot of literature search happening and a lot of elements were extracted and tried to put together in a database of information, and then try to see and simulate that level of activity. And Anton has described how well can we fit and describe this activity. But what I want to go a little bit further before is to say, beyond the structure and activity, can we look at how such a system compute? And here comes the complicated part, which is the fact that there is this dichotomy that for bottom-up models, it is very easy to build models which are going to be of a local circuit. You've got fewer elements which we know a little bit more about, and we can put them together. But at the same time, it is much more complicated to define what exactly is the computation of a local circuit. The opposite is true for the top-down models. It is much easier to define the computation at the level of a system, but it is relatively complicated to define the entire structure. So for the local circuit, we focused the questions at an element of efficient coding. And there has been a huge amount of description at the area of efficient coding, but I want, just as I put before, a little bit of a circle to oversimplify it and to say that there are two regimes of efficient coding. One, in which at the level of low noise, when you've got very high accurate inputs, what you want to do is redundancy reduction. You don't want to keep that same information coming again and again, which is presented once you're incredibly certain about it. At the same time, if you have high noise and the amount of signal is almost lost in the noise, it is incredibly important to be robust in the code what you're making, to try to squeeze out every little amount of information which is present, and to try to get rid of the noise by learning some of the statistics of it. And there is a huge amount of literature which is behind it, and I have by no means the capacity to select all of them, but I want to point out a paper by Chokmar and Trakic, in which they present a very nice review of this type of literature. To really simplify this concept is the idea that for efficient coding, a local circuit is expected to do like-to-like inhibition, while for robust coding, it is expected to do like-to-like excitation. So the question which we follow is, we worked this hard to build this incredibly complex model, taking a lot of principles about V1 structure to put it in, can we try to see from a computational perspective, which regime does it fall in? For this, we took the idea from a fantastic paper from Chetty and Chris Harvey, in which they looked at the same question in the real data. And what they did were try to perturb neurons and try to see, do you primarily see like-to-like excitation or like-to-like inhibition? The nice part about having a model like that is that you can treat it just like that, just like an experimental study, and be able to provide this type of information. So we studied it and we did perturbations which are going to be presented to a subset of neurons, and the subset of neurons are selected to have very similar orientation tuning. We can pick one neurons or a set of neurons and perturb them. And what we found when we did these types of perturbation is that we actually see both effects. That in the case of, sorry, this is missing, the graph on the left is present in the case of low contrast. And in the case of low contrast, what we see is that there is an firing rate change of nearby tuned neurons, very similarly tuned neurons. It's increased, and this continues with more perturbed neurons. Somewhat similarly tuned neurons, but not perfectly alike, are also excited to a somewhat lower level. At high contrast, there is a different interaction which is observed, in which for a small number of neurons there is relatively small effect, but for larger number of neurons there is generally a like-to-like inhibition. This sounds a little bit magical as to how is it possible for the system to switch between these, but it can be understood a little bit mechanistically. If we plot these graphs for different contrasts when we stimulate one or many neurons, and what we see is that just like it is typically observed in a lot of other systems, there is a Mexican hat-like profile of interactions in which things which are incredibly similar, they are excited, but somewhat similar, just a little bit different, there is a level of inhibition. But this function is modulated by the contrast of the stimulus and by the number of neurons which is stimulated, such that the network itself, the nonlinearities of the neurons which are present and the connections which are implemented have the capacity to already have this type of switch between efficient and robust coding. So this is an example of taking an bottom-up type model and pushing it to try to understand a little bit more at the level of computations. And once we characterize and once we have a description of the local circuit, and I would have to say that this is just a start on the level of characterization of these types of local circuit model, we are interested in trying to put together a set of these models in a larger organization. But at the same time, the question of the organization of the cortico-thalamic system, it's relatively complicated. And first, what we want to do is to look at principles of the circuit organization. So to try to look at the huge amount of data which we have and try to extract knowledge about that. So one of the ways in which the cortico-thalamic system has been described before is that it is hierarchically organized. If you think that there is a hierarchy, what you do see is a pattern of connections in which feed-forward connections have the tendency to terminate into middle layers. Lateral are columnar, while descending feedback connections have the tendency to go towards the top or the bottom layers. If you consider that these are characteristics of the feed-forward and feedback connections, then you can look through the structure and create a hierarchical model. However, as you probably realized when discussing this, this is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Which came first, the fact that we can define these connections as being, this particular pattern as being feed-forward, or the hierarchy? So in order to try to do that better, we focused on using the cell type specific connectivity data from the Allen Mouse Brain Connectivity Atlas. This has been there is a tremendous amount of incredibly useful data on a project under the lead of Honghui Zhang, which was spearheaded by Julie Harris and with significant contribution from Jennifer and Carla, in which there are stereotaxic injections of a virus, which is expressed along the axons, followed by a two-photon tomography, imaging of where those injections and projections are, and an informatic processing of the data, which is going to give us a large series of these connections. What we follow is a general idea of analyzing these connections, which moves beyond the standard mathematical view of connectivity from graph theory to go to multi-graph theory. Let me try to introduce that a little bit. But first, I want to say that this is a work which has been done together with Hannah Choi, who's a fantastic scientist who's starting her lab at Georgia Tech next year. The idea between graph theory is to try to describe connections between areas by weights. And what we realize is that these connections, the weights, not only the weights are important, but there are multiple types of connections. And these types are defined by the patterns of connections between these layers, such that what we want to do is to have a multi-graph type of analysis. The first step on that is to characterize the types of connections. There has been a huge amount of work, and for example, the first principle which can be used in order to be able to define the local circuit are defined in terms of cell types. And I would have to say that some of the things which we need to think about in the future for connecting multiple areas are necessarily going to be the connection types. We did an unsupervised clustering of these types, and we generally observed about 9 types of connectivity patterns. Next, what we want to address is the general principle of, are these organized in a self-consistent hierarchy? So what we did here is try to ask, let's try to see for any of these types of connections, is it going to be feed forward or feedback? And we search through all of the possible options, through all of the possible combinations of association between these particular types of patterns and the direction which is going to be present, is it feed forward or feedback? And we define a hierarchy for the area. The initial hierarchy for the area is defined by how many feed forward connections it receives versus how many feedback connections it receives minus how many feedback connections it receives. That is hierarchy as a target. And then we'll also look at as the hierarchy as a source versus how many, if it sends a lot of feedback connections, it has to be high on the hierarchy. And if it sends a lot of feed forward connections, it is low on the hierarchy. And we define a global hierarchy score, which is the question of how self-consistent are all the types of connections which we observed in the entire system. The system is a little bit more complicated when we include thalamus, but this is the general principle. When searching through these and trying to maximize the global hierarchy score, we find a set of patterns. We find the mapping between the types of patterns for connectivity and feed forward versus feedback connections. And when we construct the hierarchy for that, what we see is that the title question for my talk, it can be answered as yes. While there is a lot of noise and while there is a lot of variation in this, what we see is that the mouse brain is clearly statistically significant organized in hierarchy. And we can have a very clear hierarchy which is drawn, in which a lot of the areas near the top of the hierarchy are prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and things which are going to be near the bottom in the cortex are primary sensory area, visual, auditory, somatosensory, and thalamus, sensory thalamus is lower, higher order thalamus is there, and some other thalamic nuclei sprinkled in between. So for this section, I want to state that—
Stefan, it's 10 minutes.
Thank you. That hierarchy is a clear organizational principle, but it is not the only one. There are modules which can be described, and these can be combined by describing an inter-area module for the hierarchy and a hierarchy inside of all of these modules. So we described the transition of knowledge from for structural data. But we want to see, does this relate to activity? In order to do that, Josh and Sharshan are driving this project in Sean Olsen's group, in which there is a huge number of electrophysiological recordings which are happening in multiple areas simultaneously. And Josh and Sharshan were very interested to try to see if there is a relation between the anatomical hierarchy, which we described mathematically before, and the activity which is observed within these units. And the same type of code which has been used in order to try to define the anatomical hierarchy, can be used in order to define functional hierarchy. In this case, we use one particular correlate of hierarchy, which is the question of mean functional delays, which are going to be present in terms of functional connectivity within the cortex. And what we see is that there is a very high correlation between the anatomical and the physiological hierarchy. But this is not the only measure of function. Physiologically, when a stimulus is presented, the time to first spike follows the anatomical hierarchy very well. Receptive field, average receptive field for an area again follows this. There is a way in order to be able to compute how complex a stimulus is, thinking about as a parallel between simple and complex cells a la Hubel and Wiesel, but to generalize this system for more complex models, and this correlates with the anatomical hierarchy very well. So we looked and we've seen that there is a principled organization for the structure, which is mapped very well to a principle of organization of the activity. Now the question is, can we include that in the organization of the level of the computation? And what we first did in here is to try to see, can we include some of the prior knowledge regarding local circuits in some of the simplest models of description of the mouse visual system. Some of the models which are mapped the mouse visual to some of the models which are mapped to the visual system are just deep neuronal networks for object recognition. So we tried to do one thing. We tried to build a model which recognizes in this case digits, but we have examples for images and a few other things. But instead of using just the standard convolutional model, we add knowledge of the local circuit. How is the local circuit built in at every single area? In this particular example, which I'm giving you, what we add are lateral connections which introduce robust coding. And those are forming extra classical receptive fields. So that is why we called this model CNNX, from convolutional neuronal networks with extra classical receptive field. And when we tried this model, we train it on the data, we put it on, and we compare it with the convolutional neuronal network. And the first thing we did was a thorough disappointment. on the fact that on the original data set, when we introduced the knowledge of local circuit, the model did more poorly than a typical convolutional neuronal network. But where it shined was at the moment in which we began to perturb the original image. When we trained it on these data, but then what we applied was actually a very noisy set of images. What we have seen is that these types of models are much more robust to external perturbations than what typical convolutional neuronal networks are going to be. But I want to say that this is just the beginning of the process. In this case, we took just the simplest model, which is going to be at the level of a local circuit, and we introduced it into a relatively simplistic knowledge of what is going to be the architecture. The nice part about it is that we have a lot of knowledge. So in a project which we started in a collaboration with the group from Michael Weiss, what we are doing is what we are trying to put together is a knowledge of architectures to try to extract much better what is known about the structure of the cortex beyond just the simple principle that it is hierarchical. We want to have more knowledge about what are the layer distributions, what are the importance of the somewhat parallel pathways which are viewed in these architectures, in which it is not viewed as an purely one by one. And we want to combine this with multiple types of tasks which are going to be present. Initially, I only talked about, in the previous slide, we only did the question of object recognition, but that is not the only task we can try. We can think of multiple other types of elements, especially when questions which involve movies. The capacity to think about what would be the next frame in a movie is a very important type of model. And we want to see how these relate to activity, but to find answers for that, those are ongoing projects, and we only have very preliminary results for these. We'll need to talk about these at a later time. What I want to end with is a framework for trying to understand, thinking of a framework for trying to understand how we can build computations. And what we want to do is to, at every single level of computation which is needed, I only talked about the first two, which are going to be at the level of local circuits and at the level of systems, but at some point we need to try to think of doing this at an organismal level. What we want to do is characterize the computations, try to understand how they are built on the previous ones, how they relate to structure, and how they are reflected in the observed activity. And for that, we want to use both bottom-up and top-down models. In summary, I started talking about that we need to include principles of structure, activity, and computations in models, that local cortical circuits can switch between redundancy reduction and robust coding, and that cortex is a hierarchical structure, and this hierarchy is relevant for activity and computations. I would want to thank Paul G. Allen for his vision, encouragement, and support, and everyone, a huge number of people at Allen Institute, beyond those which could be mentioned by name, which contributed to the data generation and an incredibly nice and friendly environment. Thank you.
Very good. So then we have time for a few questions. One from Zach Pitko. Contrast is a natural way of changing uncertainty, which provides a computational reason for changing regime from a redundancy reduction to robust coding. But an ethological way of changing uncertainty is luminance. Have you looked at the luminance dependence of these lateral interactions?
We have not. The problem for that is that we would need to have a model, which a data-driven model, which provides us with luminance. And Currently, our thalamic model is built from data which has been built with monitors which are at constant which are there. We do not have that yet into the model. It's a fantastic question, would be great to add, but we don't have it now.
And then he also has the question, CCNX may just do low-pass filtering and create noise robustness that way. Did you compare to just blurring the input?
Yes, we did. There is a paper which is published, and we have a lot of these controls which were run. Yes, that is a very good question. We tested it, and it is clearly that is not sufficient.
Okay. And then one from Mikael Reimann. The hierarchy you built was based on a prior parcellation scheme. Could the self-consistency be further increased by optimizing the parcellation, like splitting or merging regions, etc.?
That's a fantastic question. And the answer is, I don't know. Are you interested in looking at it? Okay, it's not an answer, sorry. It's more like Jeopardy answering with a question.
Okay. And then the final question from Audrey Sederberg. Are the CNNX as susceptible to adversarial attacks as regular CNNs?
I suspect not, but we have not tried. We are not exactly a machine intelligence lab. We are a modeling lab. Would be very interested. If anyone is interested in looking at it, shoot me an email and we can forge a collaboration.